Entr'acte. The mid-century shift from revolution to evolution. The year 1940 marks the transition from Part 1 to Part 2 of the book. Like any dividing point, the choice of that year is arbitrary and is made because it falls roughly halfway between 1870 and 2015. A central theme of this book, as suggested by its title, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, is that the pace of progress sped up in one era and slowed down in a subsequent era. Figure 1.1 makes this interpretation explicit, showing that the growth of output per person increased from an initial half-century, 1870 to 1920, to a much faster rate in the subsequent half-century, 1920 to 70, before slowing in the final period of almost half a century, 1970 to 2014. The best available measure of innovation, the growth of total factor productivity, is shown in Figure 1.2 to have the same pattern of a speed-up in 1920 to 70 and a slowdown in 1970 to 2014, to such an extent that its post-1970 growth rate was barely a third that achieved in 1920 to 70. Thus, the year 1940, which divides Part 1 from Part 2, does not represent the borderline between fast and slow growth, but rather occurs in the middle of the period of rapid growth. The interpretation can be related to the sequence of industrial revolutions. The first industrial revolution, IR number 1, based on the steam engine and its offshoots, particularly the railroad, steamships, and the shift from wood to iron and steel, resulted from inventions in the period 1770 to 1820 that were sufficiently important for the exploitation to require most of the 19th century. The second industrial revolution, IR number 2, reflected the effects of inventions of the late 19th century, particularly electricity and the internal combustion engine, and had its maximum effect on output per person and on productivity in the half-century 1920 to 70. Between 1940 and 1970, output per person and output per hour continued to increase rapidly, in part as a result of three of the most important subsidiary spin-offs of IR number 2, air conditioning, the interstate highway system, and commercial air transport, while the world of personal entertainment was forever altered by television. The third industrial revolution, IR number 3, associated with information and communication technology, began in 1960 and continues to this day. Like IR number 2, it achieved revolutionary change, but in a relatively narrower sphere of human activity. The domain of IR number 2 covered virtually the entire span of human wants and needs, including food, clothing, housing, transportation, entertainment, communication, information, health, medicine, and working conditions. In contrast, only a few of these dimensions, in particular entertainment, communications, and information, were revolutionized by IR number 3. This single fact, the narrowness of the effects of IR number 3, is enough to explain why growth in output per person and output per hour began to slow down after 1970. Part 2 of this book provides an account of progress after 1940 that combines epical change in the dimensions of IR number 3, combined with a gradual slowing in the effects of change in the numerous other dimensions of the standard of living that were radically altered by IR number 2. Output measures miss the extent of revolutionary change from 1870 to 1940. The preceding chapters of Part 1 have chronicled the arrival of the modern age in the years between 1870 and 1940. The quality of life in urban America changed more quickly during those 7 decades than in any other era of similar length in prior human history. The inventions poured out from 1870 to 1900 and were implemented, developed further, and became pervasive in the middle decades of the 20th century. Electricity and running water were omnipresent in urban America by 1940, but lagged behind on the farm and in the small town, whereas the revolution created by the motor vehicle benefited farmers and city dwellers alike. Change occurred in every aspect of household well-being. Most notably, the isolated dwelling unit in the urban America of 1870 had by 1940 become networked, connected to the rest of the economy by electricity, gas, telephone, running water, and sewer lines. Although many farmers in 1940 still awaited the arrival of electricity and running water, by that date farm productivity had surged upward, thanks to inventions from the reaper to the farm tractor, which became ubiquitous between 1920 and 1950. Except in the rural South, daily life for every American changed beyond recognition between 1870 and 1940. Urbanization brought fundamental change. The percentage of the population living in urban America, that is, towns or cities having more than 2,500 population, grew from 25% to 57%. By 1940, many fewer Americans were isolated on farms, far from urban civilization, culture, and information. Moreover, many fewer were subject to the extremes of cold and heat, of drought and floods, and of periodic infestations of insects. The extent of improvement in the standard of living is demonstrated by several humble examples. In 1870, there were no iceboxes. Between that year and 1920, the icebox became the dominant household appliance to keep food fresh, yet its effectiveness required regular deliveries of ice. The development of the electric refrigerator during 1910 to 1930 is a classic example of an invention that raised both consumer welfare and productivity. Consumers benefited because the refrigerator temperature was uniform, and the productivity of society increased because the chain of employees involved in cutting ice in the northern states and shipping it to the southern states became unnecessary. By 1940, roughly 40% of American households had electric refrigerators, a figure that reached 100% shortly after World War II. The standard of living tripled over these 70 years, with real GDP in 2009 prices growing from $2,770 per person in 1870 to $9,590 in 1940. Yet measures of real GDP omit many of the most important gains in the standard of living over the 1870 to 1940 era, and, to a lesser extent, since 1940. Among the many sources of advance not captured by real GDP were the brightness and safety of electric light as compared to the inconvenience, danger, and dimness of the previous kerosene and whale oil lamps. Real GDP does not value the increased variety of food available after 1870, with the invention of processed food, from cornflakes to Coca-Cola, and the increased availability of fresh meat made possible by refrigerated railroad freight cars. Real GDP does not value the invention of the modern urban department store, which provided convenience and economies of scale in making available a wide variety of goods to the urban consumer, starting in the 1870s and 1880s. Real GDP does not value the invention of the 1,000-page mail-order catalog, which created a multifold increase in the selection of goods available to America's rural population in 1900, not to mention provided those goods at prices significantly lower than had previously been available. Real GDP does not value the removal of horse droppings and urine from city streets and rural highways as motor vehicles replaced horses over the 1900 to 1940 interval. Real GDP does not value the increase of speed and load-carrying capacity made possible by the motor vehicle, nor the flexibility of the automobile that gave birth to a new industry called personal travel. Real GDP does not take account of the epical decline in price and improvement in the quality of the motor car between 1900 and 1935, because the motor car was not included in the Consumer Price Index until 1935. In the meantime, the inflation-adjusted price of the Model T Ford fell by roughly 80% between 1910 and 1923. Real GDP does not count the value of instant communication via the telegraph, of voice communication via the telephone, of reproduction of music by the phonograph, or of instant availability of news and entertainment achieved in the 1920s and 1930s by nationwide radio networks. Real GDP does not count the difference in the quality between a Nickelodeon showing a few silent movie images on the screen compared to the multi-dimensional 1939 experience of seeing Gone with the Wind, with color, sound, and dazzling effects, for an average price of 23 cents. Real GDP does not value the reduction of infant mortality from 22% of new births in 1890 to about 1% in 1950. By some estimates, this change created more welfare value than all the other sources of increased consumer welfare taken together. Real GDP does not account for the change in the body and soul when the 72-hour weekly work schedule in the steel industry, accompanied by heat, sweat, and danger, was replaced by a 40-hour weekly work schedule in a clerical or professional job, carried out in an air-conditioned office. Real GDP does not value the increase in consumer surplus as clean running water arrived at the in-home tap and replaced the previous need to carry pails of water into the house from nearby wells or streams. Real GDP does not value the replacement of the outhouse and the need physically to dispose of human waste by the silent efficiency of public waste sewers that became universal in towns and cities by 1940. Real GDP does not value the comfort or privacy of taking a bath in a private enclosed bathroom in a tub or a shower, as contrasted with the 1870 standard of a bath in a large bin of heated water in the communal kitchen. Real GDP does not take account of the liberation of women, who previously had to perform the Monday ritual curse of laundry done by scrubbing on a washboard, as well as the Tuesday ritual of hanging clothes out to dry. Running water, the electric washing machine and refrigerator, the motor vehicle, and all the other inventions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries are linked in to the GDP statistics, which means that zero value is placed on their invention. All of this provides prima facie evidence that the growth rate of real GDP in the years covered by Part 1 of this book, 1870 to 1940, is substantially understated in all available measures. A major research effort spanning multiple projects and investigators would be required to come close to a quantitative estimate of how much of the increase of consumer welfare during this period is understated by the standard sources of real GDP per capita. Research thus far has been confined to individual output categories. The value of railroads compared to canals has been estimated at 3% of real GDP per year, the invention of tractors at 6% of real GDP per year, and the invention of motion pictures through 1938 at 3% of real GDP per year. Though no studies have been carried out for the wide range of other inventions of the 1870 to 1940 period, including the value of the invention of electricity and internal combustion engines, it is not difficult to imagine an omitted value to economic growth amounting to 100% of GDP. In fact, Nordhaus's estimates of the value of increasing life expectancy in the first half of the 20th century roughly doubles the growth rate of the standard measure of consumption expenditures. See Chapter 7. Slowing evolutionary growth combined with the ICT revolution, 1940 to 2014. The years 1940 to 1970 witnessed a continuation of rapid growth as the inventions of IR No. 2 altered the standard of living of every household. The chapters in Part 2 include those that describe dimensions of life in which the pace of progress slowed after 1970, and those in which it did not. Chapter 10 shows that consumption of food and clothing, as well as the equipment of dwelling units, changed relatively little after a transition period between 1940 and 1970, when virtually every kitchen became equipped with the modern appliances, most of which were invented before 1940. Though Chapter 11 recognizes that automobiles became safer and more convenient after 1940, the typical automobile of 2014 had much more in common than its 1940 model ancestor than the 1940 vehicle had with the horse and buggy of 1870, and the increased speed of travel after 1940 should be credited more to improved highways than to faster cars. Chapter 11 also chronicles the advance of commercial air transportation, which by 1970 had developed a nationwide network in which jet aircraft linked large cities with each other and with small towns. After 1970, every aspect of air travel experienced slower growth. Traffic grew more slowly, prices fell less rapidly, and air travel became less comfortable as seating space tightened and as the airport experience became fraught with security inspection delays. Health and medicine, covered in Chapter 14, are another category in which progress was rapid between 1940 and 1970, but subsequently slowed. The rate of increase of life expectancy was only half as fast in the second half of the 20th century as in the first half. A disproportionate share of medical advances took place between 1940 and 1975, and fewer occurred between 1975 and 2014. Penicillin, invented before World War II and in common use during and after the war, was joined by numerous other antibiotics and other medications, such as the Salk and Sabin polio vaccines. The rate of death from cardiovascular disease reached its peak in the early 1960s, roughly at the same time when the public became aware of the dangers of smoking. The main treatments for cancer, radiation, and chemotherapy were already in wide use in the 1970s. Medicare and Medicaid were introduced in 1965 and brought medical insurance to senior citizens and to the poorest segments of the population. Likewise, Chapter 15 shows that progress in working conditions and education slowed after 1970. Child labor disappeared as the high school completion rate increased from 10% in 1900 to nearly 80% by 1970. But after that year, there was little further improvement in the percentage of youth completing high school. Thanks to the GI Bill and heavy subsidies of state colleges and universities, the rate of college completion increased more rapidly between 1945 and 1975 than afterward. The standard work week for full-time workers by 1940 had already declined from 60 to 40 hours, and the unionization movement of the 1930s and 1940s achieved not only the 8-hour day, but also premium pay for overtime work. Additional progress achieved by 1970 included the civil rights legislation of 1964 to 65, the women's liberation movement, and the beginning of a massive shift of adult females from housework to market work. Thus, Chapters 10, 11, 14, and 15 all provide evidence of a slowing of progress after 1970 in a wide variety of aspects of the standard of living, including food, clothing, housing, motor and air transportation, health, medicine, working conditions, and education. This leaves Chapter 12 to convey the rapid pace of advance in the areas of entertainment and communication, and Chapter 13 to capture the essence of the information technology, IT, revolution. Though black and white television sets became universal in nearly every household during the 1950s, as did color sets in the 1960s and 1970s. By today's standards, the choice of programming was extremely limited. The enormous broadening of program choice began with cable and satellite television in the 1980s, continued with time shifting and movie rentals made possible by the video cassette and digital video recorders, and expanded further with video on demand and video streaming. The field of communications witnessed an even greater acceleration of change, particularly after the 1983 breakup of the AT&T monopoly over telephone service provision and hardware manufacturing. The fastest transition of all, as chronicled in Chapter 13, was the IT revolution. As the dominance of the mainframe computer for commerce and research yielded to the personal computer in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, the PC was married to communications through the development of the World Wide Web. After 1995, this marriage added a C for communication, as the IT revolution became renamed the ICT revolution. The culmination of ICT development arrived in 2007 in the form of the smartphone and its own revolutionary effect on social interaction. Dimensions of the post-1970 growth slowdown. As we have seen, numerous dimensions of the standard of living experienced a slower pace of progress after 1970, even as others, particularly entertainment and ICT, enjoyed a continuation or even an acceleration of rapid growth. How did these conflicting trends emerge in the aggregate economic data? Despite the flaws of GDP measurement that omit many benefits from innovation and technological change, both before and after 1970, in the absence of a superior alternative, we use the growth rate of real GDP per person as our basic measure of improvements in the standard of living. And we use growth in real GDP per hour as our basic measure of labor productivity. Growth in real GDP per person, by definition, can be split into growth of real GDP per hour plus growth in hours of work per person. When per-person hours of work decline, as when people take longer vacations, output per person rises more slowly than labor productivity. When per-person hours of work increase, as when women shift from housework to market work, output per person rises more rapidly than labor productivity. It is important to remember that GDP is the numerator of both output per person and output per hour. So all the measurement errors in GDP already enumerated apply equally to output per person and output per hour. The denominator of the ratios, the number of persons in the population, and the number of hours of work, are by comparison measured quite accurately. Thus, there is no sense in which the many improvements in the standard of living that are omitted from GDP matter more for growth in output per person than for growth in labor productivity. Figure E1 displays for 1953 to 2013 the trend growth rate adjusted to filter out the ups and downs of the business cycle in these three basic measures of economic performance: real GDP per person, labor productivity, and hours per person. The episodic behavior of the trend in hours per person, shown by the gray line in the bottom of the graph, is critical to understanding the 6 decades since 1953. Hours per person registered negative growth between 1953 and 1975, then positive growth from 1975 to 1998, and then negative growth again after 1998. The general tendency for hours per person to decline over time reflects the widespread desire of workers to use some of their rising incomes to achieve shorter hours of work. This is achieved through some combination of fewer hours worked per week and fewer weeks worked per year. In other words, more vacation time. This historical tendency for hours to shorten was interrupted between 1975 and 1998 by the influx of women into the labor force. Aggregate hours of work per member of the population rose as many women made the transition from contributing 0 hours of market work per person to a substantial number of hours of work. After 1998, the epoch of female entry abated to be replaced by a return to the long-run historical trend of declining hours, augmented after 2008 by the beginning of retirement of the baby boom generation. Growth in real GDP per person, by definition, is equal to growth in labor productivity plus growth in hours per person. This means that, by definition, the white line depicting growth in output per person is the exact sum of the black line displaying growth in labor productivity plus the gray line showing growth in hours per person. Note that the white line grew more slowly than the black productivity line during the two intervals 1953 to 75 and 1998 to 2014, when hours per person registered negative growth and grew more rapidly than the black productivity line in the middle period of 1975 to 98, when hours per person recorded positive growth. Are these growth rates displayed by the white line rapid, or are they slow? We gain perspective by noting that over a longer period, reaching back to 1891 and ending in 2007, output per person grew at 2.1% per year. When any quantity grows at 2.1% per year, it doubles every 33 years. Thus, it was typical over more than a century for output per person to double every generation. For that long century, children had the expectation that, on average, they would be twice as well off at any given age as their parents had been at that age. The white line in the graph representing trend growth in output per person lies above the historical trend of 2.1% between 1953 and 1968, and below 2.1% after 1968. The steady decline in the white line after 1999 reaches a value of 0 in 2013 and 2014. In those years, the positive growth in labor productivity of about 0.6% per year was almost exactly offset by negative growth in hours per person, resulting in 0 growth in the trend of output per person. More than anything else, it is this sharp decline between 1999 and 2014 in trend growth of output per person that lies behind the title of this book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. During the decade 2004 to 2014, the negative growth rate of hours per person was relatively flat, at a rate of about 0.6% per year. So the decline in American growth was experienced in parallel by output per person and productivity, output per hour. The sharp decline in growth, especially in the last 5-year interval, 2010 to 14, does not appear in any government publication, for the growth rates plotted in the graph represent the hypothetical capability or potential of the economy to grow, abstracting from the effects of the business cycle, that is, when the unemployment rate is held constant. Actual growth can be faster than the economy's potential when the unemployment rate is falling, and the decline of the unemployment rate from 10% in late 2009 to 5.3% in mid-2015 allowed real GDP per person to grow at its actual rate of 1.6% per year as the recovery recovered from the trough of the 2007-9 recession. Once the unemployment rate stops declining and instead settles down at the 4.5 to 5.5% range that is typical after the post-recession recovery is completed, the best estimate of the economy's potential growth in output per person is shown by the value of the white line in the graph for 2014. The disappointing performance of growth in output per person began in the mid-1960s. Clearly, the white line, which must equal the sum of the black and gray lines, was dragged down by the steady decline in the black line displaying productivity growth, which averaged 2.72% per year during 1953 to 64, and then slowed steadily to an average of 1.44% per year for the time span 1977 to 94. This decline in productivity growth by almost half reflects the ebbing tide of the productivity stimulus provided by the great inventions of IR number 2. Its successor, the ICT-oriented IR number 3, was sufficiently potent to cause a revival in the productivity growth trend to an average of 2.05% during the decade 1995 to 2004. But the power of ICT-related innovations to boost productivity growth petered out after 2004. For the decade 2005 to 2014, average trend productivity growth was just 1.30%, and by the end of 2014, had reached only 0.6% per year. Thus, diminishing returns from the great inventions lie behind the episodic waves of the black trend productivity growth line in the graph. The big difference between the two industrial revolutions is that IR number 2 had effects that were more powerful and that lasted much longer than those of IR number 3. How much did this matter? In 2014, real GDP per person was $50,600. If productivity growth between 1970 and 2014 had been as rapid as between 1920 and 1970, real GDP per person for 2014 would instead have been $97,300, almost double the actual level. That difference of $46,700 for every man, woman, and child in the U.S. stands as a dramatic symbol of the power of the Second Industrial Revolution, IR number 2, as compared to that of the third, IR number 3. Part 2. 1940 to 2015. The Golden Age and the Early Warnings of Slower Growth.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update. Please like, share and comment.